Next speaker is, we are very privileged to have Professor Simon Conway Morris of Cambridge University. He is a fellow of the Royal Society. He is the chair of evolutionary paleobiology at the University of Cambridge. He's speaking by Zoom because he was unable to fly from the UK to the United States. And he is best known for his work on the Cambrian explosion and the Burgess Shale fossil faunas and similar deposits in China and Greenland. In addition to working in these countries, he has undertaken research in Australia, Canada, Mongolia, and the United States. His studies on the Burgess Shale-type faunas, as well as the early evolution of skeletons, has encompassed a wide variety of groups, ranging from ctenophores to the earliest vertebrates. In January 2017, his team announced the discovery of an early ancestor of vertebrates, a bag-like sea creature which lived about 540 million years ago. He gave the 2007 Gifford Lectures and is the recipient of many other prestigious awards, including the 1987 Walcott Medal, the 1989 Charles Schuchert Award, the 1998 Charles Lyell Medal, and the 2007 Trotter Prize. He is the author of several books, including Life's Solution, published by Cambridge University Press in 2003. I think he has a recent book out, but I'll let him tell you about that. Professor Conway Morris is a believing Christian who has lectured widely on the relation of science and faith. And the title of his talk is "The Evolution of Humans is Inevitable, So Where Are the Extraterrestrials?"
First of all, let me please say how very disappointed I am not to be with you, obviously. It would have been a pleasure to be back in Washington, D.C. I spent quite a lot of time there as a Ph.D. student working in the Smithsonian Institution, where I started some work on the Burgess Shale. And it's also the place where I first learned to drink a proper dry martini. And in those days, it used to be at lunchtime. And I expect that's now banned, but there we go. In any case, so the question I want to try and talk about is something which really makes no sense at all, at least to most evolutionary biologists, and that is that the likelihood of something like a human evolving should, according to most of my colleagues, be vanishingly unlikely. Oh, and by the way, I should say two other things. I apologize I can't show you any slides other than my own less than pretty face and books behind me. This is because of all the problems with copyright. The second thing is if you hear sudden barking noises off stage, that's most likely my spaniel, the dog. So that's all part of the background story. So going back to the question of evolution, the received wisdom, even to the present day, I think, is one which, in fact, I was also in favor of when I was beginning to complete the first stage of my work on the Burgess Shale. And to an effect was taken forward by Stephen Jay Gould, of course most of you will know, as a very distinguished professor in Harvard, now unfortunately deceased. But he put forward this famous quote about rerunning the tape of life. If we were to go back to the Cambrian, or whenever you prefer, and start the whole merry process off again, then the likelihood of anything like ourselves evolving was surely vanishingly low. And the reasons for this are not in any way sort of peculiar. I think they're mistaken, but the reasons are that so many accidents in the history of life might sort of stalk the possibilities of actually going down a completely new direction, that how could we possibly confer any predictability on evolution? Well, again, orthodoxy that is scientifically, not so far as theology is concerned, says, for instance, that one of the principal ways of redirecting the course of evolution is through the agency of mass extinctions. And you can identify many, 5 big ones. And here, the idea more or less is that the ecological slate is pretty well wiped clean, and a lot of shocked survivors covered with dust and generally looking pretty depressed stagger back into the dim sunlight, and off they go in a completely new direction. And so Gould in particular emphasized that, for example, at the end of the Cretaceous, about 66 million years ago, if the asteroid had not impacted a location on the edge of the Caribbean, then the dinosaurs would not have gone extinct, and therefore the mammals would, of course, never seize their opportunity to evolve into things like bats and whales and, oh, by the way, primates. But in point of fact, and again, I don't have time, probably to your collective relief, to go into many details about this. I'm arguing that actually, paradoxically, mass extinctions are rather creative. And the reason for this is that in every case that I'm aware of, the groups which will inherit the world, so to speak, are already alive and well and kicking before the mass extinction. And if we take the specific case of the mammals, we can see that, in fact, they're beginning to diversify quite dramatically during the time of the dinosaurs. So what mass extinctions, in effect, do is give us time for nothing. They accelerate a process which is going to happen whether you like it or not. And so something like a mammal will evolve, I would argue, into a sapient form, roughly 50 million years ahead of schedule. Now, the point about this then is linked to something else. Again, I'll try and be as brief as I possibly can, as to not only the fact that mass extinctions are only destructive on those horrible weekends when the asteroid collides or the volcanoes erupt or whatever, or a supernova goes off. But in addition to this, evolution is far more constrained than has been thought. And a lot of this is simply common sense. It's not rocket science, because after all, we live in a physical universe which has all sorts of properties, like, for instance, the rather interesting affinity between phosphorus and oxygen, which comes in jolly useful at various points in biochemistry. But correspondingly, if we were to rerun the tape of life, as Gould has suggested, the phenomena of what we call evolutionary convergence would suggest that, in fact, the number of options, is surprisingly limited. Now, we can make a wish list of what would we like to see in a sapient form. And again, I don't intend to unpack this in any particular detail. Not necessarily bipedal, but let's allow that. Warm-bloodedness, most definitely. A large brain, thank you very much indeed. What we call encephalization. We will, of course, have a panoply of sense organs, and for various reasons, we might suppose that vision is more important than some of our other senses. But even the other senses, even olfaction, is sophisticated and complex, even amongst the humans, which are otherwise meant to be rather deficient in this regard. That's a bit of a myth, as it so turns out. So in any one of those cases, bipedality, or indeed precision grip, or warm-bloodedness, or enlarged brain size, and all the rest of it, these things have evolved multiple times. And if I have time, I'm going to come almost full circle, because I know that your interest principally is to do, well, I won't say much about AI, perhaps what I say will be unprintable, but with regard to extraterrestrials. Because if we make the assumption that evolutionary convergence is something which is going to quite strongly constrain the endpoints. And, I should say, of course, this is not a theological point. You can make something of it if you certainly wish. I'm certainly not suggesting that everything on the planet is busy trying to evolve into a human. And, of course, another sort of paradox is that if we compare life, actually even in the Cretaceous, say 100 million years ago, let alone 500 million years ago during the time of the Burgess Shale, it's pretty clear that life today, or at least until we started to take over the planet, was more diverse than it had ever been in the past. And this, of course, is just a reflection of continuous diversification. And indeed, that famous figure in Darwin's Origin shows exactly that, continuing diversification. But the point about this is that, though indeed life has become, I think, overall more diverse and more interesting, it would be reference to a particular paper to do with the dentition and jaws of fish. But in this paper, it's actually to do with the labrid fish, as it happens. They have this very telling remark in either the abstract or the title, to the effect that divergence is local, convergence is global. In other words, you can diverge as much as you like, but again, the same solutions will crop up again and again. And I could give you thousands of examples, from anything to do with insects to the bacteria, even viruses, which seem to be rather topical at the moment. And let's not get distracted on that. So now that we understand that not only is the universe rather large and has very many stars, but as these remarkable programs, especially Kepler, but also other ways of detecting so-called extrasolar planets, and I don't doubt your other contributors and speakers have already spoken about this in great detail. The number of Earth-like planets, I am told reliably, I'm not an astronomer, but I'm fascinated in the area, of course, because like any proper person, we're fascinated in everything. But the number of exoplanets is absolutely stupendous, even in this galaxy. And the number of Earth-like planets is also very, very large indeed. And I understand that, in fact, in principle, they should more or less be in a majority of all planets, but of course, at the moment, are on the very edge of detectability. Now, of course, many of these Earth-like planets will not be in areas where you can make yourself comfortable. They'll be too hot or too cold, as, for instance, Venus and Mars remind us. And also, there are all sorts of other sort of discussions as to how the things may play out. Now, indeed, as and when we find extraterrestrial life, then our notions of what is convergent will go to the test. And I should say, almost in parenthesis, that there are certainly possibilities that the way in which individual planets evolve may not be similar to the Earth. And so, to return really to Stephen Jay Gould's point, a number of my colleagues would protest at what I'm saying, in as much as, although we understand what's happened on the Earth to some degree of accuracy, might it not be possible that there are sort of individual, what evolutionary biologists call bottlenecks, particular concatenations of circumstances which must come together? Otherwise, the next stage of evolution will never be achieved. Now, I've already tried to explain why mass extinctions will not derail the process. But another way of looking at this, put forward by the philosopher John Beattie, is that indeed one could imagine a causal chain, A to F, say, where if point C drops out of that chain, then when you'll never be able to get to point F. Now, again, convergence suggests that this is not a serious problem, and indeed we see some striking examples where something has been either abandoned, but more often reinvented from often rather mysterious antecedents. This is not an argument, by the way, for intelligent design or anything like that. It's just simply that there's still a great deal we don't know about where particular molecular systems actually came from. And there are good reasons why this is difficult to understand. But in any case, to return briefly to the extrasolar planets and the likelihood of something like ourselves evolving, then so many are these potentially habitable planets that even if, 90% or more end up with little more with what the Americans call pond scum, sort of echoing the so-called rare earth hypothesis, then the numbers are still so large that in principle we should not be alone. And here, of course, apparently we run into a very significant problem. Well, to begin with, of course, we don't have any evidence at all of extraterrestrial life. But I'll come back to that in a slightly oblique fashion in due course. And the problem here, of course, is not so much that our search sphere is absolutely minute, but what has been pointed out by Charlie Lineweaver and various other people is that the recency, so to speak, of the solar system is such that there were many, many other solar systems which far, far predate ours. The earliest planets, I understand, are formed roughly 1 billion years after the Big Bang, and solar systems analogous to our own are forming perhaps 7-8 billion years ago, whereas our solar system, which we know is very reliably dated using meteorites in particular, is 4.6 billion years. So there are other solar systems which potentially have habitable planets, amongst which will evolve sapient species who may well develop a taste for space travel. And if that is the case, then bluntly, we shouldn't be here. Because as I've pointed out elsewhere, what happens is during the time of the Burgess Shale, our visitors from across the galaxy arrive, and they're involved in the diaspora of the galactic civilizations. They descend to the Earth, and of course there's next to no land life, just bacteria. It's pretty boring, frankly. But they're swimming in a lagoon are little creatures around about 2 inches in length, looking a little bit like an eel. And because these extraterrestrials, I hope, are, like myself, seriously interested in gastronomy and always willing to try a new extraterrestrial species, they're quickly netted, they're grilled, and somebody suggests opening a bottle of Chablis, and I approve very much of that as well. And they settle down and enjoy a very nice meal on the edge of a Cambrian ocean. There's only one snag with this. That line of proto-fish are our ancestors. So to put it, in a nutshell, we would have been colonized, so to speak, far in advance of any possibility of ourselves evolving to talk about it. Well, we can, of course, consider all the options, as these, of course, revolve around the famous Fermi paradox, as to roughly where are they. Well, as I'm sure you probably all know, this famous conversation in Los Alamos in, I think, 1950, actually was more to do with the way in which interstellar travel might actually be possible. And of course, at this time when technology, very largely courtesy of somebody called Werner von Braun, who'd of course been recruited by the Americans very shortly after the war, was something where people could begin to speculate about the likelihood of traveling across interstellar space. But nevertheless, Fermi's paradox is now being more or less sort of boiled down to the where are they? Where could they possibly have gone to? And there's a book, and I'm sure there are many other books which I should know about, by Stephen Webb, which I have something in the order of, I think, 76 different explanations as to where are they. And perhaps one at the moment, which is somewhat in our minds, is that we are insufficiently intelligent not to destroy ourselves. And this may, of course, be the case that one simply gets to a certain stage of evolution where you become irreversibly self-cataclysmically self-destructive. I'm not going to buy into that one at all, as it happens. But Webb, at the end of his second edition, if I remember correctly, sort of concludes, well, really, none of this really quite adds up. And there's been a sense that, by and large, we're missing something rather obvious. Come on, as I say, the numbers are large. The probabilities seem very much in favor of other sapient species. And, there are other ways of looking at these things, to look at other ways in which, an extraterrestrial civilization might sort of enshroud the whole of a star, a so-called Dyson sphere, or move to a so-called Kardashev Type 3 civilization. And here, although our ability to detect exoplanets is relatively restricted, although gravitational lensing actually allows you potentially to look much deeper, I believe. But in the case of of an infrared object which is anomalous and might potentially represent something equivalent to a Dyson sphere or even a whole galaxy, then again, a whole lot of searches are being done, including ones of galaxies, where a number of candidate galaxies have indeed been found, having whittled down a list which initially was in the hundreds of thousands of galaxies. That's a big number. And so far, unless something's changed today, still nothing. So all of this is a sort of drumbeat to suggest that something here isn't making a great deal of sense. Well, if I remember the title of a paper I published fairly recently, which much to my gratification has been almost completely ignored, and that's what I like. Down with the H index, down with all this citation rubbish. But the title of this paper was 3 explanations for extraterrestrials: sensible, unlikely, mad. And as I argue, in fact, it's the last one, mad, which actually is the correct answer. And it might even begin to have, if not a theological resonance, at least possibly a bit of a metaphysical minefield. And not to spoil a story way ahead of my conclusion, as ever, we need to think about the sort of universe we live in. And we may be in for the odd surprise. So very briefly, the sensible one, of course, is the one which I've already referred to in passing, that, simply maybe civilizations blow themselves up or whatever, but that one way or another, there are lots and lots of extraterrestrials out there. And after all, as mentioned, maybe, we've just had the misfortune to be in a rather quiet period. And there are little ancillaries to this, for instance, which are being put forward by various people, that we are at a stage of galactic evolution whereby one moves from a time of relative danger, and this is often linked to arguments to do with gamma ray bursts, which are no fun at all, to times of relative quiescence, where not only can life survive in the oceans, but actually come onto land, where, of course, you're much more vulnerable in principle to a gamma ray burst. And so if these things decline, then it means that, round about the same time, all across the galaxy, there are lots of people called Enrico Fermi looking around, especially into the sky, and saying, well, that's funny, where on earth is everybody? Because we're all asking the question more or less at the same time. Well, as I mentioned, I'm not an astronomer, but my understanding is that there are some sorts of galaxies which are certainly dangerous places to be in terms of gamma ray bursts. And they, I understand, have several different origins, but our galaxy isn't one of them. So I'm not saying this is, the explanation, but the sensible explanations are all out there, and Stephen Webb's book does a very fine job in trying to outline this. Well, what about unlikely? Well, that could simply be that, blow me down, we're alone. That, it's just the way it goes. And if one was looking for a peculiar bottleneck, then conceivably it might be the origin of life. Possibly, as has been suggested, it's a fantastically improbable thing. Now, I hold a little brief here. I used to read into this area quite extensively, but some years ago, partly because of other distractions, I lost the will to live, in as much as, the papers appeared, and they were often extremely ingenious chemistry, and they remain so, and sometimes some new factor, boron, for example, has a walk-on part. And it would be unfair to say there's not been progress. There most certainly has. But even so, and no doubt because of our scientific, sort of not illiteracy, but our lack of scientific understanding of this problem, the question of quite how you enclose things in a functioning cell to enable it not only to metabolize, but also to replicate, is a huge hurdle. And nobody denies this. And of course, needless to say, the Intelligent Design Brigade, of which I have no time at all, absolutely not, has seized upon this as something where we're beyond the limits of science. But even if it was the case that the origin of life itself is just something so fantastically improbable that it might have only occurred 2 or 3 times in the visible universe, then that could perhaps explain the Fermi paradox. Well, the problem there, so far as we don't know the answer, is, we know that the ingredients to make life, although are present in much more diverse forms in things like carbonaceous meteorites, but nevertheless, all the building blocks can be made in totally unexceptional circumstances. And not surprisingly, quite recently, there's been renewed interest in comets. And maybe that's a laboratory where life forms, because it's a rather convenient place in as much as most of the time it's freezing cold. So the chemical reactions grind to a halt, which of course typically involving things which are otherwise very sort of labile. Ribose is a famous example. And then every now and again they get close to the sun, warm up, all those reactions go hell for leather, so to speak, and then off into deep space where they're frozen again. And then the next time round, this comet does not approach the sun, it collides with the Earth and thereby seeds this planet with the beginnings of life. Now, I've no brief as to whether this is actually correct or not, but I would like to think that the origin of life is no more unlikely than anything else, but it's still open to debate. Well, what about mad? Well, this is an area where career suicide is an easy option. And also, I should explain, you can probably tell from my rather sort of, shattered appearance, I've retired. So in a certain sense, I can say whatever I like. Oh, that's a good point. Can you say whatever you like in this world? Well, we better be careful. Otherwise, we might be cancelled, mightn't we? That'd be awful. Dear, oh dear. The nature of the universe we live in may be far more peculiar and odd than we think. And we can approach this question from many, many different directions. Now, certainly, I imagine the majority of you are, if not everybody, are believing Christians, as it was mentioned in the introduction, am I. I belong to that sort of eccentric runaway group set up by Henry VIII called the Church of England. But I can reassure you that my interests are very much with G.K. Chesterton and with Catholicism. So I hope there's no gulf between us. But as Christians, for example, I'm not saying this has got anything directly to do with extraterrestrial life. I myself subscribe wholly to the idea of the incarnation and also the resurrection. And that these, in my own view, are in a certain sense, however we understand them from a physical perspective, are totally and utterly real. They happen. One can be inferred. The other one was witnessed by people who we have every reason to think were reliable. So theologically, that's a hint that things are not quite as the materialists would suggest. So we've been around this one many, many times in the past. And I'm not sure we're going to get that much further in the foreseeable future from that particular direction. But it's a reminder of where we might be. But now, career suicide. In the last month or so, and I don't introduce this to be either mischievous or amusing. That's I find hard to do at the best of times. Amusing, that is, of course, you will have seen these various video files released by the Pentagon. Oh, yes. And this is the old area, back to Roswell, of the UFOs. Oh, no. He's not going to talk of those, is he? Now, what interests me about this footage as it happens is, first of all, I think it's genuine. I'm fully aware that, of course, there are tricks going on in the Pentagon, I don't doubt, and they may well be faking things to see what other powers make of them, conceivably. But the voiceovers I hear from the pilots, and having had a tiny bit of experience in this area, also flying in some fairly small planes in quite interesting conditions, suggests that these guys are not given to whimsy, especially when you're in charge of something called the Hornet, which I believe is a rather dangerous aircraft, and it's worth a great deal of money. So what interests me about these is that these objects are showing no conceivably normal behavior. And what particularly interests me at the moment, and I'm not saying there may well be people who think this is just so tangential as to be irrelevant, but I'm not sure it is that there's a sort of speculation that maybe the Russians or the Chinese, to take examples at random, are now on the verge of developing technologies which are so far beyond what we are familiar with that we really should pay attention. Well, there's mirrors within mirrors, walls within walls, confusion within confusion. I don't want to make anything particular about these things because in many other respects, they are mad. They are completely mad. They make no sense at all. Yes, they have patterns and all the rest of it. But what I think is worth thinking about, and there's no consistent strand here to follow, is that if we are interested in considering the possibility that our universe as we perceive it in terms of our own spatial understanding, which is about as best as we can do, because please don't ask me to even speculate as to what time actually is, then there may be innumerable, for want of a better word, orthogonal realities which intersect our own world. One can, have a lot of fun with this particular idea and try and unpack it in different sorts of directions. But it then takes you off into whole areas which are always dismissed by mainstream science. And, in a certain sense, you can't blame them because they've got to have, some sort of bedrock on which to work. And indeed, they would insist on a day-to-day basis that, one virus remains looking much like the same virus as you looked at the day beforehand. But such people as Jeff Kripal, who some of you may know of, who's, I think, in Rice University, and he and a number of other people have published a series of absolutely extraordinary books. And all these, of course, in an ironic sort of way, depend on human witnesses, which we know, of course, especially from legal point of view, can be dramatically unreliable. And we know how easy it is to delude ourselves into thinking we're seeing things. But I would suggest that so widespread and universal are encounters, for want of a better word, and we can think of many other examples which are broadly called the paranormal, but that's again a risky area for some theologians. But other ones, of course, will just say, oh yes, I'm perfectly familiar with that. Don't worry at all, I can't explain it. But they collectively suggest that what we're actually engaged in is something to the effect that our world is just a minute fraction of what there is. Now, how does that have anything to do with AI? Well, next to nothing, I'm afraid, because I'm not anything in the way of computer literate or AI literate. I apologize, I cannot remember the exact paper, but I came across a paper, I can't even remember his Christian name, called Bishop, which was published, I think, a year or two back. And from my perspective, because I not an area I really can understand in any detail, but he had an absolutely withering review of the potential of AI. And it would be difficult for me to summarize his arguments with any briefness. But in essence, he points out that, what computers have done to the present day, and we're not talking about things which hardly count as computers now, are fantastically good at one particular thing. But the idea that these things in any sense are or ever will be conscious, he regards as delusional. And I would agree, as it happens. And Jeff Kripal in particular, and a number of other people have sort of pointed out that all the materialist attempts to understand consciousness are doomed to failure. They're simply not going to work. And really at a fundamentally obvious reason, because it's completely different. It's other. It's not the same. We have it, we encounter it. However we do it, of course, is another question. But a significant number of people who aren't strict materialists are more than happy to consider that the brain is, to use the well-known cliche, is much more akin to an antenna. It's something where we access mind as a whole. Now, that may or may not be of theological relevance, and you can see actually very quickly how you can move towards heterodoxy here rather than something which people would be familiar with in the Vatican, or perhaps not. I don't know. I think they're pretty broad-minded there, as it so happens. So this brings me, and I'll finish in a couple of minutes to your immense relief, actually full circle to something which I have been reading a great deal about in the last few years. And in another sort of way, I think is actually relevant to the Fermi paradox, might be relevant to consciousness, and might also be relevant to evolution. And that is the question as to how come that only we, so far as we know, have things like language. No other animal does at all. And this is a tremendous paradox, of course, because certainly as an evolutionary biologist, I'm totally content. Indeed, I would defend it to the death, that there is evolutionary continuity between ourselves and the great apes. And Darwin, of course, was insistent, and he was no fool, that this was a matter of continuity, yes, but also the differences in mental states must be ones of degree and not of kind. And yet, if you begin to unpack all the evidence, and you have to go into the fine print in a lot of these papers, you find, in fact, that there is a genuine gulf which somehow we have moved across. And again, one can introduce theological arguments here. They're not necessary, but they may well assist in particular areas. And I could go through a very long list of the sorts of things which are referred to by a scientist called Thomas Suddendorf, who I've never met, but it works in Australia, which he calls the gap, this disjunction between ourselves and animals. What is it which separates us? And the interesting thing is that when you begin to unpack this, there are a whole lot of features which we possess, which are often claimed to be present, not least in chimpanzees and crows and so forth, but on closer inspection seem in fact not to be there. Now, obviously enough, this is controversial territory, and you'll have no trouble finding plenty of animal behaviorists who will insist on this continuity. But let me just give you a few examples. The one which in a certain sense is the most telling is language. Because animals vocalize, undoubtedly. And amongst the convergences, one of the most striking involves birdsong. And the neurology of the brain is actually interestingly convergent. But the similarities at first sight are very striking, not least famously. And here, of course, I talk about the songbirds and the two other groups of birds which independently have evolved learnt song. I'm not talking about innate song here. This is song from the tutor, which is usually the father, so I believe. But the young birds will, to begin with, experiment with the sounds which will crystallize into songs in a way which is remarkably akin to what we call babbling in our infants as they begin to experiment. As I remember vividly, but of course I was far too young a father to really appreciate what was going on with my own children many, many years ago as they began to babble into something which we've turned rather quickly into English. And birdsong seems again to have structures in it which we could refer to as semantics. And also even, semantics in as much as there are particular things in it which are repeatable, and also syntax, in other words, it's got a structure. But once you begin to disaggregate this apparent similarity, the idea that in any way these could be referred to as proto-words or proto-language evaporates. And the whole set of reasons for thinking this, I mean, one is to begin with, that of course the birdsong is more or less sort of not monotonic, but it is on a single dimension. So, for example, the birds never export their language into any other sort of context. It's used, of course, in things like mate attraction and defense and all the rest of it. But it's not used in the way that we redeploy all our words in an effectively infinite way. And correspondingly, of course, we show the feature almost universally. There are some interesting exceptions, recursion. So we can embed sense into sense into sense and actually have an almost infinite depth of understanding. And then correspondingly with regard to birdsong, when you begin to sort of say, well, how is it that some birds have, 3 or 4 songs and others have 60? But in no case are the ones with more songs in any sense more versatile mentally or anything like that. So I would suggest that in point of fact, the animal vocalization, are simply ones of what we call the imperative. They're not declarative, that they're not actually dealing with the conveying of meanings of any sense at all. What they do extremely well, and they do it for good Darwinian reasons. And there's no doubting their complexity or their interest, but they don't have anything which is akin to language. And it seems in a way that actually language is almost central to everything else. I'm not saying it was first. In fact, discovering what was first amongst the things which we regard as being humanly unique is actually, I think, impossible, which again is a hint, perhaps, that we're not really dealing with the historical process here. But in essence, when we then look at all the other aspects of animal behavior, for example, this is an example I mentioned in a talk quite recently, to which one or two may possibly have heard, and I apologize for repeating myself. There's a famous set of experiments whereby you have tubes full of water where crows can be trained to drop objects into, thereby raising the level of water and retrieving a food item. And this is something which, of course, echoes a famous fable in Aesop of the thirsty crow dropping stones into a pitcher to retrieve a drink rather than a piece of food. And these experiments and observations at first sight are absolutely extraordinary because it really does look as if the animal knows what it's doing. But of course, we are ingenious and sometimes mean-spirited. And we so arrange the experiments that, for instance, we introduce extra tubes or tubes of different diameter, or even worse, tubes which appear to be connected, but concealed underneath the board are not. And we can very quickly work out cause and effect. We can work out where the weakness is in the link. Animals can't. It seems pretty clear that they simply do not understand cause and effect. And if indeed you again take the materialist viewpoint, that cause and effect is just something you sort of do naturally, instead of beginning to think that it may be something fundamental to the universe, yet there's something there which is underpinning something called meaning, then you will begin to understand that actually this failure, so to speak, of the animals is not their stupidity, but in an immediate context, of course, why on earth do they need to know? They don't. But actually the paradox is the other way around. Why do we need to know? Why do we worry so much about these sorts of things? And I'll just conclude with, in a sense, a general observation. I could talk about, for instance, the fact that animals learn, but they're incapable of teaching. But it's to do with an experiment to do with rhesus monkeys. And in this particular case, they were interested in the properties of what we call entrainment. And here they were using a metronome. Now, I'm not musical, unfortunately, but so far as I can understand, you can alter the pitch and so forth. And you can see whether they can get the idea of a dance rhythm. And it's pretty clear for the most part that animals do not dance. Yes, we know about Snowy, the cockatoo, but by and large, they don't dance. They don't have a sense of entrainment. A few animals drum, yes, but arguably this has nothing to do with what we call music at all. But in any case, the point about this story is that for a whole year, this group of experimenters, I think of two of them, in fact, kept on seeing whether they could train these rhesus monkeys in the art of entrainment using these metronomes. And they couldn't. And what does this tell you? Actually, it tells you nothing about rhesus monkeys. And why should it? If rhesus monkeys can't entrain, then what's the deal? Who cares, frankly? If they could, but they can't. What it tells you is something absolutely fascinating, that here on this planet, there is a species which is willing to spend an entire year trying to see whether rhesus monkeys can entrain. We are the anomaly. It's the animals which are perfectly normal and perfectly all right. They're the ones, we should admire because they're getting on with their lives and they do it very successfully. But what they don't do is what we take for granted. So although this has been a highly confused delivery, and I, again, apologize, I hate Zoom in any case, and I wish I could be with you personally in Washington, D.C. And although I've been Zooming all over the place, what I'm trying to get across is the idea that theology to begin with may well tell us something to our benefit, but also if you stick to a materialist explanandum, including AI, including extraterrestrials, then you are going to be disappointed. Whereas, of course, I would take a much more optimistic view that we've only just begun with our exploration. Now, I'm not quite sure when I was meant to finish, but I can see from your expressions that you're wishing I'd finish immediately. So that's exactly what I'll do. So thank you ever so much for listening to me so patiently. Thank you very much.
So are there any, maybe I can start with a question. The title of your talk had to do with the inevitability of humans. And as I understand it, being a particle physicist and not a biologist, there are certain developments in the history of life on Earth that were sort of one-off. The emergence of sexual reproduction or of multicellular organisms or of going from prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells, and maybe in humans' language, that didn't happen over and over again independently, but seemed to have happened in the history of life on Earth just one time. So I would say, I would ask, couldn't one argue that the emergence of, not to say humans, but of highly clever animals even, such as chimps, is not inevitable, but that there might have been a number of bottlenecks that were extremely difficult to cross, and we see that because they only happened once on Earth.
You could certainly be correct. And in the particular case of animals, as I've written elsewhere, I mean, what may be the case is that there are all these other planets which are Earth-like, and indeed they're full of animals hooting, purring, growling, chattering, the usual cacophony you hear out there, birdsong and the rest of it. But none of them are saying anything of any interest at all, except to themselves. Whereas we would like to persuade ourselves that the reason we talk is, in a certain sense, to understand what's going on in somebody else's mind, which is something, in my opinion, animals simply are incapable of. And in parenthesis, I mean, what would slightly puzzle me is that indeed, if you look at the vocalizations of many different animals, birds and mammals in particular, at first sight, they look almost identical to ours in as much as they use a larynx in our case, or a syrinx in the case of a bird. And one sort of says, well, hang on a moment, wouldn't it be useful, I mean, from a Darwinian perspective, and not only to involve yourself in, chatter, but also to say, oh Fred, behind you, I don't want to worry you, but there's an enormous snake. And not in terms of a warning hoot and so forth, but to convey information which would ensure that Fred did the right thing in the right order. And corresponding when chimpanzees hunt, at first sight, it looks as if it's an organized hunt. It's not. It's just a pack of individuals looking for red colobus monkeys. But you'd think the adaptive pressure on something so close to ourselves, where they can actually say, look, Fred, you just go over there and wait there. I'll pass you the rifle in a moment, and so on and so forth. They all the time, these things seem to be on the very edge of humanness. And yet there seems to be something which hasn't got there. Now, you may be right that something happened, most likely in Africa. Who knows, maybe. It doesn't really matter where we went through some, bottleneck, and people, for instance, have argued in terms of population size. And actually, there's some reasons to think that's a contributory factor, but not otherwise the explanation. And then you refer very reasonably, of course, to all these other things which are seemingly unique. Well, in the case of, for instance, well, perhaps arguably the most important to do with, in the trade we call eukaryogenesis, in other words, prokaryote going into a eukaryote. Of course, we can't be sure. It does look as if the eukaryotes themselves have a single origin. I mean, again, in parenthesis, one of the things which is known about, but very much not emphasized, is that the earliest of these eukaryotes are incredibly complex. They're not simple at all. In fact, what evolution does is streamline. That's the apparent simplification, but that's another story. But the point is that within the prokaryotes themselves, there are two things which matter. First of all, a very substantial amount of the machinery you need to make a eukaryotic cell are already present in prokaryotes. They've got different functions, but of course in evolution we know how good it is at co-opting things, and tubulins and actins and things like that, which are essential for the eukaryotic cytoskeleton, are already present in prokaryotes. And there are some groups of prokaryotes, especially the planktomycetes, which, for instance, have reasonably good approximations for things analogous to internal vesicles and something approaching a nuclear membrane. These are otherwise regarded as hallmarks of the eukaryotes. So from that perspective, it is, of course, possible that there's something, as I mentioned in John Beattie's work, where you just had the misfortune or the good fortune to have either achieved something which in all other respects would be staggeringly unlikely. But I'm very hard pushed to think of anything which is genuinely unique. I mean, endosymbiosis, for instance, there's a wonderful example of an amoeba known as Paulinella, which is busy acquiring a chloroplast, or the equivalent of a chloroplast, at the present day. So yes, that might be the case. But again, I would be not at all surprised, as I mentioned a moment ago, that there are indeed planets all over the place, stuffed full of animals, doing the sorts of things which David Attenborough describes with such delight, but are now not doing anything, not saying anything. And why are we different?
Thank you. And now I'll let people in the audience ask questions. Yes.
Thank you very much for your highly entertaining and informative talk. I'm Jordan Wales from Hillsdale College. I have sort of two questions, but I'll try to keep it brief. The first about the animals and entrainment. I read a popularly oriented article that stated that the only animals that dance, or at least that among the animals that dance, you have the birds and only those birds that learn their songs. And this article was proposing a link between the possibility of apprehending and then physically participating in a rhythm and the possibility of apprehending and reproducing or innovating upon a song. So that was one thing that perhaps you could comment on. And the other thing is that it seems that you're suggesting that everything is inevitable except language, or that perhaps language is the one inevitability that we can't explain, whereas convergent evolution and perhaps deep rhythms of the universe can explain the other inevitabilities. And so I suppose that's where you bring in the area that might be called paranormal. And I'd be interested to hear you comment on that a little bit more, too. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. They're both very important points, obviously. The business about entrainment and so forth, and there's this famous, much-watched videos of Snowy the cockatoo, and his ability to dance is really spectacular. And there have been suggestions by Matt Cartmill in particular as to there may be a connection between aspects of song, which we see in the parrots and in the songbirds and in the hummingbirds and so forth. The point here, in a way, is I think is if you look long and hard and carefully, you can usually find some animal doing something of an approximation to what we regard as human. But they're not generally, using them for any particular, so far as we know, interesting purpose. I mean, one thing, for example, yes, you do get coordinated swimming in dolphins, for example, but by and large, anything like a ballet or river dance or something like that is something which is unknown amongst the animals, pretty much because, you've got to understand what's going on in your neighbor's head. And all of this, including language, I would suggest, and I don't think that's actually the trigger, though other people have suggested it, are ones which the animals don't possess. And, you can always pick up, a little example here and a little example there. And the other thing also you've got to be slightly careful in this particular area is what happens when animals are in captivity versus when they're in the wild. And one of the interesting observations is what's called enculturation. And to the first approximation, animals, especially those which are brought up in very close human company, which used to be in the old days true of some chimpanzees, for example, and indeed parrots, is that they're perceptibly smarter than their chums in the wild. But they don't otherwise show any signs of getting any closer to humanness. So you can, for instance, after years of effort, get a chimpanzee to begin to struggle with the elements of sort of ordinality and mathematics, but they never go beyond that. So again, we can go on a sort of case by case basis, but collectively, those sorts of exceptions don't seem from my perspective, really to add up to much else. Your other point about language and such things as the paranormal and the fact that we have this uniqueness and all the rest of it. Actually, that's another story. But I mean, I've never seen one. I know other people who certainly have, including my mother. But if you're talking about ghosts, for example, which we know a materialist is not allowed to exist, quite wrong too. But of course, you've got to decide exactly what you think you're talking about. But there are plenty of examples of animal ghosts, so don't worry too much about that. But the point here, of course, is exactly why I like reading G.K. Chesterton so much. Not because he had a particular interest in science. In fact, he was rightly suspicious of where we were going. But of course, he loved paradox, and it was always constructive. And it's not quite the same, but I'm always struck by these. I know this is hardly answering your fair question, but the famous quote by Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist, and he said, "I like your idea. I think it's absolutely crazy. The problem is it's not crazy enough." And it's really a question in the end of. I'm told you can have a technology, I believe, which because I have a friend who uses Zoom all the time. As I mentioned, don't really like Zoom very much. You can actually see what the titles of the books are behind by zooming up on it. You probably do it yourself, but I don't suggest you look. Don't worry, they're perfectly clean. But there's a great deal of stuff about paranormal. And if I was to turn my screen in one direction, you'd see rows and rows of stuff by the Inklings, and then beyond that, loads of stuff by G.K. Chesterton. The point here is that, in a way, if you get yourself into a mindset where these things simply are impossible, so we have pretty much Western thinking at the moment, which is utterly dismissive of these possibilities. And if you try and put this forward in the academy, then, as I mentioned, it's career suicide. I mean, people think, oh, poor old Conway Morris. And maybe they're right. Perhaps I'm going off my rocker. It would be, not unknown. But I would suggest that actually once you begin to read into many, many areas, and even, I'm not a philosopher, but when you go back and see what people are writing roughly 2,000 years ago, and then you suddenly realize actually they're doing something which we've forgotten. And amnesia, intellectual amnesia, so I'll get completely carried away. I don't know how bad it is in your country, but at the moment we've got a craze of taking down statues. And our Archbishop of Canterbury has said he's a bit worried about these statues in the churches, which may in fact be depictions made of stone, images, old boy images, which are of people who frankly weren't very nice. And he's suggesting we should perhaps take these down. And my own view would be, well, how dare you? That's my history. It's pretty unglamorous. It wasn't all bad. It wasn't all good. But they're there. Nothing I can do about it. I wasn't born. So I go off at a tangent here. But the thing here is that if we close avenues of thinking and simply do this sort of Bloomsbury group Russell, oh, nobody believes that. You can see Virginia Woolf shaking her head. Oh dear, who thinks that? All you got to do, as I'm sure all of you do, especially in your parishes, is just go out and talk to the people, which I believe one of your candidates of the presidency referred to as deplorables, and just chat to them, as we do a lot. And they will tell you all sorts of stories. And they'll say, that's funny, you know, it only happened once. It's just after Mum died. And they'll tell you a story. So I haven't answered your question quite deliberately, but it is, of course, to encourage everybody to keep an open mind.
Okay, well,
Hi, thanks for the great talk. You've mentioned Chesterton a few times now. He's one of my favorite authors. And I was wondering if you had a favorite work by him.
Oh, dear. Not The Man Who's Thursday, I'm afraid. I mean, he's best in his essays, frankly, which are incredibly prescient. But The Flying In, I think, is the one I'm dipping into at the moment. I read it, I've read it a couple of times. And for those of you who don't know the story, it's actually set in this country. And I have to be slightly careful what I say, but amongst their wizard wheezes is the banning of alcohol. Oh, yeah, we've been here before, haven't we? Absolutely. And it also, I mean, again, I'll get complete carried away. And I gather from what I hear in your country, maybe not all states, but apparently, and in fact, I remember seeing the email, you don't have to wear a mask. How can you be so reckless? Dicing with death, the whole lot of you. Whereas here we are absolutely hamstrung by this government, which is entirely hysterical about largely non-existent dangers. And Chesterton in The Flying in a very different sort of way, depicts what happens when intellectual elites decide what's best for us, rather than us being given a reasonable latitude and deciding that, yes, we should not allow children to play with atomic bombs or dynamite, but to the first approximation, we should be allowed our freedoms. And we're hoping very much that we're creeping back there. But I have to say, perhaps some of you as well, I found the last year, frankly, terrifying as to how, at least in this country, the majority of my friends are still frightened and they are still in their bunkers. And, you know, I've had enough of this rubbish, but it tells you something very interesting about the zeitgeist of today. And in fact, we should have seen it coming. And it's no surprise that, in fact, this is part and parcel of our general intellectual timidity.
there's time for one more question. Yes, back here.
Thank you. Can you actually see us, by the way?
I can see your back. Sorry, this is very flattering. I can see the back of your head. So don't worry.
I thought so. I thought you were looking that way. I'll stand this way then, so I can address you.
Oh, thank you very much for the courtesy.
Some years ago, there was a lot of chatter about something called biocentrism. I don't claim to be very familiar with this, but I reviewed some books for a cousin of mine about it. I was wondering if you had any opinions about it and if it has any significance as far as you can tell to the question here.
Thank you very much. If I'm correct, what you're referring to is the sort of thinking, especially by E.O. Wilson. I hope I've got the right chap, I know, and I think on biocentrism. And I reviewed one of his books for Nature, of all places, which is not a journal I want to look at the moment for some reason. I suggest you go and see what they say about the evidence from the virus. Any case, and he is, I think, I've never met him. He's an extremely distinguished scientist, but I don't think he would take it as an insult to suggest that he's a pantheist. I believe he started as either a Baptist or a Methodist, I believe, in the South. But no matter. But in essence, what I think he's trying to argue in his books, by and large, is that in a way which is very admirable, that life as a whole is, well, we would say holy. But it is something where we are part of it. We're a product of evolution. And therefore, we mustn't not only turn our backs on it, but it could effectively provide the seed ground of the future religion. And indeed, you can go off in all sorts of tangents here. And some people might suggest that environmentalism, and also what, at least in this country, we call Extinction Rebellion, and those sorts of things, and indeed the programs by David Attenborough, in their various ways are attempting to remind us of the dangers we face if we carry on being reckless. And I'm certainly not necessarily agreeing with all that they say, but the idea of biocentrism, in a way, I think actually goes almost full circle back to Chesterton, because he, and in a very different way, C.S. Lewis, whom, again, I'm an enormous fan, knew perfectly well, in some ways, how noble paganism was. After all, Lewis in particular knew the area inside out. But also, in fact, it's going nowhere. And this would be another set of stories. And I was just thinking about this the other day. I mean, why was it that Christianity was such a runaway success in those early centuries? And I think there are many reasons, of course, and also the Romans fortunately put on a superb infrastructure. It's absolutely incredible. And I think people underappreciate what it was like. They even turned up here in large numbers in 43 AD. But in fact, what it was that the society there was basically horrible. It was a dreadful place to be in. It was not even so good if you were wealthy and influential, because if, for instance, you think about Pilate's boss, Sejanus, and so forth, look what happened to him, as you read in Tacitus. And then if you think of the total dependence on slavery, if you think of what happened to the people working in the galleys and the mines, so far as we can infer, it was truly and utterly horrible. And one can't help but feel that although, of course, our materialist friends are saying, oh, well, they were subscribing to pie in the sky stuff about a good time in the future, the reason it came home so dramatically was that for the first time, they were given hope. They were given the sense that really they mattered, even here today, let alone any future life. And I think that our danger here again is that if we just, neglect other people, then we can be as pious as we like about nature. And so I admire it as an evolutionary biologist. Beyond the sophistication is staggering. But if you decide to go back to paganism, then you're going to have a set of very nasty surprises.
So I want to first of all, I want to thank you and do something that I should have done when you finished your talk, but I was so enraptured by your talk that I forgot to do it, and that is invite the audience to applaud and thank you for your talk.
Thank you.